Okay, let's invite Dave. There we go. I hope this is working. I think I'm streaming live and I think he's coming. Okay, great. I see you, David. If you want to click on send. This is working great. I sent you the invite, Dave. Click on accept, or maybe it says streamline. Oh, there you are.
Hello.
Fantastic. Oh, this is so good. Thank you so much. So much. Like a lot.
That's quite all right.
Yes, you're in the right place. People are arriving already. They are watching. You can see them in the comments.
Hello, everybody.
Okay, they can say where they are watching from. Most of them are Argentina, but not in my town. So if you guys want to say where you are, it's good for us. Okay, tell us something about you seem to be having a summertime there. You're wearing a t-shirt.
What, in the UK? Yeah, well, I'm based in Oxfordshire. So I work in London at the University of Arts London, which is a really big creative arts university, the biggest one in Europe, maybe in the world. We're not sure, difficult to measure. But I live in Oxfordshire, so if you've seen The Hobbit or read The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, I live in the Shire, effectively. I mean, there aren't any actual hobbits, but this is where it's based. So it looks very much like the Shire does at the start of those films around here. It's all very gentle green countryside. And yeah, it is the summer. Yeah, it's the summer here. We're Northern Hemisphere. So, but obviously we're all in lockdown, which is quite nice because it means I don't have to commute backwards and forwards to London. So I get a chance to enjoy the late spring and the summertime more than usual. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is great. I'm using this lockdown to talk to the authors we read, like you. So this is great for me, a great opportunity.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. It's nice to be able to do things like this, and it just goes to show how useful the internet is, that we can just carry on and do new things, even though we're all stuck.
Definitely.
Are you in lockdown in Argentina? You must be, right?
Yeah. Yes, we are. Right now,
Yeah.
I live in a small town and we have permission to go shopping, to go for a walk for an hour nearby. And we have some permission, but it's locked down in the whole country.
Yeah, it's a bit like here. Yeah.
Yeah, we're having the numbers every day are not nice. So we try to stay home and do everything from home. Okay, I'm going to ask you some questions that I got from people watching now.
But it's fighting its way back again.
Yeah, but I think we can manage. Don't worry, we are used to this in South America. Okay, in your videos, you speak a lot about literacies and you use the word in plural.
Hang on, my headphones have decided to disconnect, I think, or something weird's happened because now your audio is not coming out of these.
Okay.
Say something.
Hello.
Hang on, you know what I'm going to do? Just for safety's sake, I'm going to switch to my old-fashioned wired headphones.
Okay.
Because then I know exactly where I'm at.
Older technologies are okay from time to time.
Plug them in.
Very untidy. Okay,
right.
That's probably better. Yeah, that's better. That's more reliable. Let's do that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's all good.
Good. In your videos, you speak a lot of literacies and you use the term in plural. I'm very interested in a very brief summary on that.
What, yeah, I suppose it's to do with digital literacies, and I suppose it's because if you think about the term literacy or being literate, then it would relate to reading and writing, I guess. But in the digital, there are multiple literacies to do with connecting, networking, making videos, working like we are now, podcasts, because it's multimedia. There'd be all different sorts of literacy. So I suppose why it's plural, it's a good question. I suppose the reason why it's plural is to indicate that it's more than just reading and writing. It's much more nuanced than that. Yeah. And I also think literacy, the concept of literacy is a very particular thing that is to do with the way that you learn how to read and write at school. So it's very specific, whereas I think with the web, there are all kinds of different literacies, and that's something interesting. So for instance, with Instagram and Twitter and other social media, the way that you'd write is very different from the way that you'd write more formally in a normal literacy, because you're writing in a way that's somewhere between written language and spoken language in terms of its tone. So that's a very particular literacy, and learning how to switch the character of your language as you change from community to community or space to space, I think is really important. A good example of that is, I don't write emails like I'm writing a letter. I just start and then say, thanks, Dave. But if I write to my vice chancellor, who's like the head of my university, then I always have to start, dear Nigel, blah, 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 best wishes, David. Because for him, an email's a letter, but for me, it's not a letter, it's an email. So that's another, do you see what I mean? It's different people approach these different spaces with different types of literacy. So that's probably the reason why. That is a good question. I don't think I've ever thought about that.
I'm very interested in that because I teach English. Well, most of the people here with us are teachers of English as a foreign language, and we're supposed to teach language that it's not our native language, and in a world that is not always our native word, because we not all the teachers are familiar with technologies, and in this way you are talking about like switching and understanding the differences. Okay, so it's very interesting, very interesting. What advice would you give a teacher of English as a second or foreign language as regards these literacies, and like not relying only on teaching reading and writing?
Oh, you mean like the various types of literacies? I think, I suppose if you're talking about the internet, then predominantly people are using a form of English language that's closer to conversational than it is to traditionally written forms. So my email example is a good example of that. But also, as it would be, I guess, in any language, there's also the use of slang or colloquialisms. Does anybody know what a colloquialism is? It's a strange word. And you know, and emojis and all of those kind of linguistic things. So I think, yes, certain aspects to the language, if it's not your first language, are going to be quite difficult to identify. If in doubt, be conversational. If you're online, I'd say. But also, I'd say there's a kind of global linguistic culture that's fairly global, that's around emojis and certain abbreviations. I mean, the abbreviations are usually abbreviations of English, but obviously LOL is pretty global. And so you know, you can rely on those things to express sentiments in a relatively universal way. I mean, a smiley face is a smiley face. Oh, I did hear something really interesting about emoticons, if you want to call them those, which was that in the West, we tend to express emotions by the shape of our mouth. So you get the smiley face and the sad face, whereas in the Far East, it's more with the eyes. So their text emojis are based on the eyes, and they did a bit of research where they showed people, you know, smiling with their mouth but not with their eyes, and it was difficult for people from Eastern culture. It was harder for people from Eastern cultures to identify the emotion. So even just smiley faces aren't completely international. But yes,
Wow.
I think generally, if you go with, I think if it's going to be the conversational end of things. Anything that that you've learned when you're talking in a conversational mode, I think you can bring onto the internet in quite a safe way.
Okay. In your videos, especially like when you started with the visitors, residents as modes and as a continuum, I was wondering, how do you think the way this going online for most of the teaching due to lockdown, how do you think that affects our relationship with technology as regards going from resident to visitor, a bit more, a bit less?
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, for me, the lockdown has kind of, I feel like it's proved my point because I always said it was about motivation to engage. And if I think about what's happened at work, for example, everybody's learned how to use our virtual learning environment and Microsoft Teams in about 2 days, because it was either that or nothing. So people that I wouldn't have normally expected to see engaging with that have suddenly become resident, not because, and the reason they weren't resident before wasn't because they weren't intelligent enough to use the technology. They just had different ways of living and different ways of, what they felt was authentic about connecting was much more face-to-face. And so I think for a lot of people, the face-to-face is the default, which makes sense. And then they'll do digital if they can't do face-to-face. I think what's happened with the lockdown is that's completely the other way up. So everything's digital except for the very rare moments where it's face-to-face. So in a sense, you could argue that our lives are now like 80% resident online and 20% resident physically, whereas it used to be the other way up, sort of instantly. And I've not seen, you know, my mum learned how to use Zoom because that was the only way she could carry on getting on with her life, right? And so it's definitely not gone by age, because if it had gone by age, then anybody over the age of something wouldn't exist socially or professionally. But of course, everybody does, because when you need it, you learn it. We're good at that as human beings.
Yes, and I agree a lot with you. And in fact, I have like I know a lot of people. My sister, for example, she's younger than me, but she's more like a visitor in your theory. But it's easier to define like that. Definitely, definitely. What do you think about students feeling embarrassment because they have to do homework and post it on social media, for example, when teachers ask them do this and share something on, say, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and they don't want to do that because it's like embarrassing. Yeah. How can you explain that?
Well, that's the reason why, I don't know if you've seen a visitor and resident mapping quadrant. So it's got visitor and resident along the horizontal, and then it's got personal and institutional. And that's one of the things we discovered very early in the research, was that context is really important. So I think what happens is that schools, and to a certain extent universities, they understand that their students are in social media all the time. So they sort of say, well, if you're in social media all the time, just post your work up there. But actually, they're in social media in a very, very social, personal context. And posting your work is related to a completely different part of your identity. So it's this massive context shift, which is why the quadrant is like it is. So the way that we operate online socially tends to be very differently to how we'd operate online from a sort of a scholarly point of view, or a professional point of view, or an institutional point of view. So I think actually it's a massive shift that sometimes people don't identify, because they're like, well, young people use this stuff all the time, so we'll just get them to carry on using it and they can do it with their homework. But in actual fact, most education systems, until you get right to the end of them, like towards your PhD or whatever, everything you do is very much in private.
I think I'm losing you. Let's hope.
you're back. I lost you for a second.
I think I lost you right when you were saying the most important bit.
Connection comes back. Hello. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's coming and going.
It's
Yeah,
coming.
so that's something I think that's happened at universities quite a lot as well, in terms of asking people to blog. You know, and the difference between handing in an essay that would be private between you and your teacher and then you'd get a mark back, or writing a blog and then everybody commenting on each other's blogs, is a huge shift. And I think it's really hard for people to do until they feel like they're a sort of a legitimate person within that subject area, like they've got some expertise. So I think it's a really it feels risky. It makes you very vulnerable. I mean, we're used to that at my institution because obviously it's creative arts. So people are doing things that make them very vulnerable all the time, because the whole point of the creative arts is you make a thing and then you show it to a bunch of people and then you have a discussion about it. But in most educational scenarios, as I say, yeah, work is very private until you've sort of established that you've got some kind of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what happens if you do that without any sort of scaffolding or framing around it is only the really confident students tend to post, and then you don't really get that much out of it. Can you hear me now? Are we back up and running? I think we are, aren't we?
Yes. I think there are some like interruptions, but on the whole, people haven't complained yet. So guys, if you're listening and if this is going okay, please let us know if you hear us. And
hang on a second. My Bluetooth headphones decided to steal the audio. There we are. I'm back again. Okay, I'll try that one again.
Okay. Can I go with the second question? Second, third?
Yeah, keep going.
Now. Okay. You said that in one of your videos, you ask yourself some questions, and maybe this is connected to blogging and tweeting your own ideas. You said, is it a valid use of my time to build up a professional network online? And is it legitimate for me to discuss my thoughts about what I write on blogs, like the way we're doing right now? So what can you tell us about that? Is it legitimate? Is it valid?
As for anybody to do that? Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the big leap, isn't it? I think it is legitimate. I think everybody's entitled to an opinion. And I think you just got to have the confidence to start writing, really. It's a difficult thing with something like blogging, is that, you know, some people are worried that anybody could read their blog. And then if nobody reads it, it feels even worse. So I think the thing that you have to do, I think you just got to start, you know, and start building up, getting into the habit of it, and start just building up some posts. It's really useful to do it in conjunction with social media, because then you can direct people to your posts. And I suppose, yeah, it's an important way of developing your writing, but it's also an important way of gradually developing your own professional identity as well. I mean, that's what happened to me. I wrote a blog post about a little research project I'd done, and then 3 weeks later, I was in a conference, and the guy giving the keynote was using my blog post. So I was like, okay, I like this. And he said, oh, this is Dave White's stuff. Shout out to Dave White. So that worked really well for me. Now, it wouldn't necessarily always happen that way. I just happened to have done a bit of research that was really timely. But I think the thing is, to begin with, you should write it for yourself as a way of, yeah, as I say, developing your voice, if you like. And then maybe people will start responding to you. Or maybe they won't, but I know I've got a lot of colleagues that will write blog posts, and then they're much more organized than I am. And then what they do is after 2 or 3 years, they go back through and use the blog posts to create chapters for books, and then they'll write a book. So it's always useful. It's always really good stuff that you can go back to. But in language terms, I think I really like the blog post as a format, because, you know, you've got between 500 and 800 words, and you need to have you need to get across a really well formulated idea in a relatively short amount of space, and I think it's a really good exercise. If you're not saying anything, then why are you writing the blog post? And if your blog post turns out to be 3,000 words long, then maybe that's not right either. I've accidentally written blog posts. It's really easy to accidentally write too much, or I mean, it is obviously English my first language, but it's the idea of it being short but it having a really clear argument in it. I think is a really good exercise.
And what about Twitter, that is even shorter than that?
Yeah, again, I think Twitter's really good. So I wrote a blog post called Elegant Lurking, because lurking's this idea of you hanging around in online spaces but not saying anything. And back, 10 or 15 years ago, people were quite suspicious of that. But actually, one of the really good things with Twitter is you can just follow people that you're interested in or professionally interested in, whatever. You don't have to say anything, but you can see how their conversation works. So it's a really, really good way of sort of tuning into the way people speak and the sort of things they talk about, and you can follow the links. I know a lot of students do that, but they'll follow a whole bunch of people that are in their subject area, but they won't necessarily say anything. And then there comes a point where you feel confident enough to join that conversation or to start contributing to it. So it's a really nice way of getting used to how that particular community talks before you say anything. And you can't really do that. There's no face-to-face equivalent of that without looking really, really weird. So I think that Twitter's a really good place to get used to how people talk and how that dialogue works before you have to say something, and then you can gradually get into that conversation. So that I'm a big fan of that kind of social media because you don't have to talk if you don't want to.
Oh, that's great. Let's see this question over here. You said that students or young people in general, they come with a wide range of modes of engagement that are super different. So in a class of 30, 25 students, we would expect 25, 30 modes of engagement. How can we cater to all sorts, and what can we do so that our lessons are interesting for most students with those characteristics?
Yeah, well, I think, so I did quite a lot of work with a group called the Higher Education Academy in the UK, because they were really interested to know whether students in particular subject areas, this is in higher education, had a particular modes online. So whether, if you were doing fine art, you'd be more visitory. If you were doing computer science, you'd be more resident. Actually, it went the other way. But generally speaking, and this is where this came from, there wasn't that strong a pattern between different discipline areas, because it came down to the individual more than the subject. So in any given subject, some of the students would be more resident or more visitor, depending on what they were comfortable with. So exactly as you say, in any class, there's going to be a range of students operating in different ways, and it doesn't necessarily come down to their literacy. A lot of it comes down to which literacies they're comfortable using in an educational context, like the personal and the institutional. So I think the main thing to do is, if you want to engage with your students in a particular way, or you want them to work in a particular way, is you have to be explicit about why that's of value to them. So if you want your students to get into a tweet chat, or you want them to blog, or you want them to make short videos, or whatever it might be, you have to pick carefully. It's really important to explain the value they're going to get out of engaging in that mode. Sometimes we forget to explain. So people might say, hey, we're all going to write a blog post. And you don't mention that actually, not only is that going to help you to learn how to write in a particular way, but it's also going to help you to learn how to comment on each other's posts, which helps you to get into a particular community and understand how to network and understand how to get into particular, certain forms of discourse or dialogue. As long as you explain it, the value that the students are going to get out of that mode, then I think they're going to be much more motivated to get into it. otherwise, what happens is, and this is my opinion, but I think this is the case, is that students will start from the mode they're most used to and then be confused why you're doing a weird version of that. So if you said, I want you all to blog, and you don't explain what the benefit of blogging is, then most students will go, why are we writing this essay in a really, really weird and scary way? But if you explain, then they'll go, oh, okay, I can see. I'm learning some things that are useful for me and are going to be useful for me in the future. So I think that's the answer to your question, is just be really explicit about what's in it for them to engage in that mode. And that also helps you acknowledge the bits that are difficult. Because if it's something where they're being quite open and quite visible, then you can go, yeah, that is a bit scary, but you know, stick with it because it's got all these benefits, and nobody's going to be horrible because this is in an educational environment, and so you'll be fine. And that's really just to do with scaffolding. That's that idea of scaffolding in terms of teaching, really.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned motivation, and that's a topic we always discuss as teachers. Can we say that moving to the institutional, from the institutional to the personal, and the resident corner would be the most motivated students in the class, the ones that are comfortable as residents and personal in our subjects?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the thing is that it depends. You have to separate out the difference between learning and assessment, I think. Assessment's where it gets in sort of tricky. So one of the things that I usually say is that you can be a very successful student in most educational systems and be almost entirely visitor, because our pedagogy, the way that we teach, tends to be based on that sort of very individual sort of mode. So a lot of education isn't based around being visible. A lot of it isn't based around group work or collaboration. So if you think about the education system you might have been through, certainly the one I've been through, until I decided to go to art college, then I could do pretty much all my work without talking to anybody, just sitting and listening in the lessons and going to the library and reading some stuff, writing an essay or doing an exam. And if you think about an exam, which is like 80% of how assessment works, it couldn't be any more visitor. You sat on your own, specifically not allowed to talk to anyone. So I think the thing to be careful about it is to not imagine. So sometimes that's what we do as educators, is we're keen on those resonant modes because we instinctively understand the benefit of them, especially with language teaching. But then the students are very instrumental, or they're very strategic, quite rightly, and they look at the assessment and go, well, why would I do that? It's not going to help me get a better mark. So I think if you're keen on the value of resonant modes, then you need to make sure that the assessment makes sense relative to that, which is a difficult thing to do, because it's very difficult to assess visibility or networkedness or, you know, all of the rest of it. And I think that's a really tricky area. So I suppose the answer to your question is, yeah, they might be more confident students in terms of being more extroverted or enjoying that mode. They're students that get a lot, they learn well in that mode. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be your most successful students, depending on how you've designed the whole sort of flow of of that process through to assessment. It's a tricky one.
Mm. You mentioned something in your videos, and I think it's coming there, that there's a learning black market, that students kind of pass exams, but there's, well, what can you tell us about that? The black market of learning.
Yeah, so this is something, I mean, Wikipedia is the best example of that, and I think it's a tricky one. So what happens is, I think students have a really good understanding of what's authentic or what's legitimate in terms of their formal institution. So if you ask students, even students in higher education, well, how did you go about learning, what you needed to learn? Then they sort of instinctively understand that books are better than the web, in terms of their authenticity, or books or journal papers or whatever it might be. And so whilst all of us, basically anybody who's trying to learn something new will go to the web and Google and probably end up on YouTube or Wikipedia, because that's what you do when you're learning something new, right? And obviously our students are learning something new all the time. So that means they're doing that all the time, but there's a little part of them that feels like that isn't authentic or isn't right. So they won't talk about it. So what happens is when you talk to your students about how they go about learning things, they'll sort of tell you what you want to hear, which means the actual way they're learning is like in a black market. They won't talk about it, even though it's really effective quite often, or you have to be really careful with that conversation. So I think as educators, it's really important to, again, be explicit and talk to our students about saying, Wikipedia is fine, YouTube's fine, of course it is, right? And then that stuff starts to come out into the room, and then I think students feel more comfortable about then it becomes part of the fabric of what they're doing rather than something that they feel like they ought to hide or ought to hide. I think that's changed a bit, but it's still there.
It's still there. And what do you think the big difference between the meaning of learning and the meaning of knowing is?
Oh, what? That's a huge question. It's like a big philosophical. Okay. Well, I suppose for me, there's not much point in just remembering things these days, because the web does that for you. And so I think for me, the existence of the web means that it shifts the emphasis back on how you connect bits of knowledge together and what you do with that knowledge, rather than just remembering it. So you could argue that's the difference between knowledge and information, or you could argue it's the difference between information and wisdom, or something like that. And it'd be nice if our education systems responded to that, so that our assessment was based less around remembering things and more about doing things with the information that we get or that we have. And I think I don't know, it's probably Finland. It's normally Finland. I think there are examples of exams where you can just go anywhere you like on the internet, because the questions are all about how you combine knowledge and how you respond to an area of complexity, rather than just remembering particular things. It was somebody said to me once that knowing the question, what's the capital of France, is the same as knowing the answer Paris. Do you know what I mean? So for me, a really good example of what I'm talking about is it means that being able to ask a really good question is more important than knowing a specific answer. And what that does is it shifts everything sort of down age-wise in some ways, because that's what you'd traditionally be doing towards the end of your higher education. But actually, I think we need to start teaching children in that mode from the age of 6 or 7, because otherwise all the homework is just a copy and paste exercise. You don't necessarily learn anything.
Oh, this is so true. It happens to us in grammar, for example, or vocabulary. Sometimes we focus on the bits, like the grammar, the ing, the pasts, regular, irregular, but then if they don't do something, meaningless.
Yeah.
My final
exactly.
question.
Mm-hmm.
You started talking about co-digital.
Yeah, but that was a sure.
What happened with that? But I liked it.
Right. Okay. Well, I should never have tweeted that word. That's a terrible. Yeah. I mean, I suppose what it is that it's just with lockdown, it's just suddenly accelerated everything massively, and I've seen people writing about the idea that actually the COVID-19 has sort of accelerated us 5 to 10 years into the future in terms of the way we work with digital. And one of the interesting things, so that's what that weird word was, is like the effects, the digital effects that have come from the virus. But many people tweeted me and said, never use that word again. Because I think it's very difficult to pronounce as well. So,
Yes.
but yeah, no, it's definitely a phenomena, even if you didn't, maybe you'd want to use that term, maybe you want to use a different term, but the phenomena's there. And I think that what's been really interesting to me is the amount of people at my university that are saying, we suddenly had to do everything online, and we were really anxious about that. But many things are better, like our classes are better attended. Some of that's probably to do with the lockdown and nobody having anything else to do, but also, even in areas like we have some student awards and stuff like that. We've got more people applying for those. I think for a lot of people, it's been a richer experience. And I think for a lot of students, they've actually found it more inclusive in some ways than face-to-face, especially when I think the mixed mode really helps. So there's a lot more opportunities to write a question or to engage through text. And I think as long as it's not going too quickly, students who don't have English as a first language, that really helps. So in actual fact, it's less confrontational to ask a question in a digital environment than it is when you're in a massive room face to face, where you only ever get the really confident people answering. So there are kind of winners and losers in that, if you want to look at it that way. But that's what I meant by that phrase was, I think there are things that are happening that people don't want to lose after we get out of lockdown. And somebody described it to me in a really nice way. He said, it was the Centre for Sustainable Fashion that we've got at our university was saying, we've suddenly, overnight, we stopped doing everything that was terrible for the planet, or most of it. And now, as we come out of lockdown, we've got to decide what things we put back in. Which things do we switch back on again, and which things do we never go back to? And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. So, for example, I think there's going to be a lot of staff and students that will never want to go back to big lectures face to face because they've got to get on a train, they've got to get on a bus, blah, blah, blah. But then again, the other side of it is that it's just nice to be in a room with a bunch of people, and I think we're all missing that. So there's a balance in there. But yeah, there's going to be some really interesting effects, and I'm really interested to see. It's clear to me that a lot of people have found being resident online much more rewarding than they expected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that.
So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. It's going to be interesting. People are desperate to meet face to face. It makes sense, but I think we'll still. I think the whole world is going to stay more resident forever. Not as much as we are now, but quite a bit more than before.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit about your present research? What are you up to at the moment?
Oh, well, I'm spending most of my time helping my university get online and then respond to all the things that are coming up. So it's interesting for me. So it's actually more, I think it's just been a time of really actively applying my research to the situation. So every day I log on for work and I go, oh, that's quite a difficult thing. How are we going to deal with that? And I go, oh, wait, I've thought about this before. I just need to actually apply some of these ideas. And that's worked quite well. So a really good example of that is I did some work a couple of years ago around open practice, and I wrote some open practice principles for the university because I really like that idea of being completely open online and the advantages of it. The point I made was instead of asking the question, could we be open with this? You start by saying, let's imagine everything's open practice. Which bits of it actually shouldn't be? Do you know what I mean? Do it the other way up. So you go, well, let's just imagine that we did everything completely openly online. Which bits of it should we actually do privately or semi-privately, of which there are lots of good examples. Anyway, that was a couple of years ago. I presented that to my university and everybody was really confused. They couldn't understand. I didn't explain it very well. But now, just in the last couple of weeks, everybody's coming back to that idea because they're going, wait a minute, that thing that Dave said, that's sort I can kind of see where he's coming from. So a lot of what I'm doing is applying work that I've done in the past, I'd say, and really paying attention to what's going on. But I do feel like the research and the ideas that I've been developing over the last decade, I suppose, are just been massively amplified by lockdown, which is nice for me. Even though it's a horrible situation overall, I think that it's been interesting to see, as I say, like at the start of our conversation, it's been interesting to see how quickly people have adapted because they needed to.
Okay. Thank you a lot for answering all these questions.
No, it's my pleasure.
I had a great time. Just the coffee was missing. The rest was perfect.
True. Yeah. Okay. No, you're welcome. That's great.
I'll keep up to your works, your Twitter as usual, and blogs. And okay, we can meet in the future with more questions.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.